Hello everyone. In continuation to our strategic management, in this video we will understand about different types of strategic controls and also different approaches to strategic controls. Some of the types of strategic controls are premise control, strategic surveillance, special alert control, and implementation control. First, we will understand about premise control. It is a strategic control mechanism that involves monitoring and managing the underlying assumptions or premises or conditions that shape an organization's strategy and decision-making processes, which means the primary purpose of this premise control is to ensure that an organization's strategy remains relevant, effective, and aligned with its environment. So the premises can be related to market, or it can be related to technology, it can be related to regulatory, it can be related to economics premises also. So how to implement this control? First, you try to identify the key premises, basically to determine the critical assumptions underlying our strategy. Then start establishing a monitoring system, which means track the environmental changes and the premise validity. Then develop a response plan, means prepare something like adaptive responses to premise changes, and then integrate it with the strategic planning, means incorporate the premise control into the strategic planning processes. Then after that, start regularly reassessing the premises and adjust your strategy. So if we consider some of the tools and techniques what are being used for this is our SWOT analysis, then we can do a scenario planning. Decision tree is another tool available, sensitivity analysis, then environmental scanning. So these are all some of the things. Here, a simple example is given. Consider a pharmaceutical company developing a long-term strategy based on the assumption that a particular drug they are developing will receive regulatory approval within a certain time frame. This is their premise or assumption. Based on this, they need to keep monitoring to really achieve this. That is what is premise control. We'll move on to the next. Strategic surveillance. It is also a strategic control mechanism that involves continuously monitoring and analyzing an organization's internal and external environment so that you can identify any potential opportunities or threats. That means the primary purpose of this is to provide timely and relevant information to support strategic decision making and drive the organizational adaptation. So how do we implement this? We need to first define the scope, sources, and methods, how we are going to establish our surveillance system. Then identify the relevant metrics like key performance indicators. Then identify and analyze trends, threats, opportunities after analyzing and interpreting the data. Then we have to develop some response plans to those. Finally, you integrate with the strategic planning. This is how we can do. Again, tools are almost the same. SWOT analysis can be used. Scenario planning can be used. Market research reports can also be used as a tool. And in order to have a good strategic surveillance, best practices are continuously monitoring and adapting, integrating with the strategic planning, and then use multiple information sources, analyze and interpret any data effectively, maintain a competitive intelligence. So these are all some of the practices what we can adopt. Here a simple example is given. Consider a technology company operating in the smartphone industry that employs strategic surveillance to stay competitive. Let us move on to the next. Special alert control. This is again a strategic control mechanism which involves identifying and responding to exceptional or unforeseen events that may impact an organization's strategy or its operations. So the primary purpose here of this particular control is to ensure timely direction and response to some critical events so that you minimize the potential harm and maximize the opportunities available. The implementation steps can be you establish an alert system like defining some triggers or having some protocols for that. Then identify some key risk indicators, means so that you can able to monitor the critical metrics. Then you develop a response plan. You have to prepare for some potential events, what can be expected. Then train your people, ensure them the awareness and response readiness. Then finally, you review and update so that you can continuously refine your alert system. And for this to happen well, you may have to have some best practices like establishing some clear protocols, conduct some regular drills and training, ensure that your stakeholder is very well communicated, continuously monitor and refine, and then finally integrate with the strategic planning. Here a simple example is given. A company closely monitors its financial performance. If there is a sudden and significant drop in sales, a special alert control system might trigger a review process to analyze the cause and then take the corrective actions to address the issue promptly. Let us now move on to the next control, which is implementation control. This ensures the effective execution of an organization strategy by monitoring and adjusting the implementation process, which means that the primary purpose of this control is to ensure that your strategic objectives are achieved, identify and correct implementation errors, optimize your resource allocation, enhance the organizational learning. So these are some of the purposes for this particular control. And how do you implement this? You need to first establish clear objectives, then develop your implementation plan, then monitor the progress, evaluate and adjust, and then provide a feedback so that the organizational learning also will grow. Some of the best practices for this to happen is to establish clear objectives, monitor progress regularly, encourage open communication, continuously evaluate and adjust, and encourage your organizational learning. So these are all some of the best practices which can be adopted. Then comes different approaches. One is your traditional approach to strategic control. So here, a manufacturing company following the above might set a long-term goal to increase production efficiency by 20% within 5 years. Basically, this approach involves a top-down, a hierarchical and a bureaucratic process to monitor and evaluate the implementation of an organization's strategy. So the characteristics of this will be like centralized decision-making will be there, a formalized structure will be there, hierarchical control will be there, standardized process, and then focus on the efficiency. So these are certain characteristics of this particular approach. Both advantages and disadvantages are there in this approach, because if you say advantages, it's very clearly clear lines of authority will be there, whereas disadvantage it may be inflexible. Some of the companies who follow this type of traditional approach is Tata Group's traditional approach to strategic control. Even Indian Railways, a bureaucratic control structure that can be considered as an example for this traditional approach to strategic control. So in this, you set some performance metrics related to your output, wastage reduction, or machinery utilization. And then periodic reviews would assess your actual performance against those targets, whatever you might have fixed. And if there are deviations, then you take corrective actions accordingly. And it is generally this approach is having a traditional and a clear framework for control, but may sometimes struggle to adapt quickly. That is what I was telling, inflexible to rapidly changing environments. Next type of approach is the contemporary approach to strategic control. This involves a flexible, adaptive, and decentralized process that monitors and evaluates the implementation of an organization strategy in a dynamic environment. So the characteristics naturally will be, this will be decentralized decision making. This will have a decentralized decision making, flexible in structure, adaptive control. Focus will be more on innovation. Emphasis will be on the learning aspect. So these are all some of the characteristics of this. Again, this also has got advantages and disadvantages. Advantages, best you can say adaptability to change is the topmost advantage in this. And it also encourages innovation. Whereas if you consider disadvantage, it requires definitely a strong leadership. And it needs a high risk tolerance. If you consider Indian company example, you may consider Infosys Adaptive Strategic Control, or I mean that you can say that as an example. In this tools and techniques, what they use is your balanced scorecard, strategy maps, and then KPIs, performance metrics, BI tools, business intelligence tools. These are some of the tools and techniques what they use. Here, if you have to have a contemporary approach in your organization as a strategic to control your strategy, then you can follow some of the best practices like encouraging the culture of innovation, encourage people to have a continuous learning, develop your adaptive leadership. These are some of the best practices what you can follow. Then comes your operational control, which involves basically monitoring and managing an organization's day-to-day operations so that you can able to achieve your strategic objectives. So the primary purpose of this control is to ensure efficient resource utilization, optimize all your processes, improving your productivity, enhance your quality, reduce your costs. So these are some of the purposes of this operational control. So the characteristics of this will be, of course, on focus on the internal processes, and you always emphasize on the efficiency and the effectiveness. You try always to do a real-time monitoring and keep giving feedback also, and you will always be on toes in the sense continuous improvement will always be happening. And as far as possible, you take decisions based on data. Means data-driven decision making is also another key characteristic in this. So Tata Steel, they have their operational excellence initiative. Even Infosys have their quality management framework. So these are some of the Indian examples who follows this. Even the best practices what you can adopt is that you establish a clear objectives. Means the setting of standards here, it's mentioned as qualitative as well as quantitative. And then your key performance indicators you will be monitoring, measuring and monitoring. And then you always focus on having a continuous improvement culture in your organization. And then you conduct regular audits and reviews so that you can able to take some corrective actions after identifying, in case if you identify any deviations in that. So these are some of the best practices what you can adopt to have your operational control the best.